Today on Cars That I Did Not Expect to Be Driving, an ex-competition Aston Martin DB4. And this isn't exactly the kind of car you'd think would be owned by someone who, in their own words, says, as a young person, they had no interest in cars whatsoever. How did they end up here? Well, that's all thanks to a physics teacher and a Cortina. You see, that old Cortina was essentially the tour bus for a very small folk band, comprising of the physics master, Nigel, this car's owner, and a couple of other students. It wasn't a particularly healthy car, and not before long, they decided it needed some serious work. However, rather than give up on it, the physics master insisted they could fix it. And fix it they did. A Haynes manual was purchased, the engine disassembled, and in Nigel, a spark was lit. Later on, Nigel persuaded his mother to let him swap her Opel Kadett estate for something more befitting of a young man. He bought a Triumph Spitfire. It was terrible. It leaked some oil, burned the rest, and required constant tinkering. He loved it. It was also around this time that Nigel discovered his passion for Aston Martins, when a friend of his was celebrating his 21st birthday. As a gift, a wealthy uncle let them go out for the weekend in an Aston Martin V8, and they both were smitten. From that point on, as far as Nigel was concerned, the ultimate car was an Aston V8. But the Aston Martin dream was going to remain just that for quite some time, because even though they were cheaper then than they are now, they were still somewhat inaccessible. So, when the Spitfire needed replacing, he bought something a touch more affordable, an unloved and somewhat underappreciated BMW, a CSL. One thing about Nigel's CSL ownership that I'm sure will delight and shock people in equal measure is that he took it sprinting. I suppose the right thing, given that car's competition history, and it also instilled in him a passion for track driving. Still, Nigel never seemed that far away from an Aston Martin, and the very V8 that he'd experienced a few years earlier came back into his life when it suffered a few issues, including an engine failure. The uncle made an offer to his nephew that could not be refused. If you can fix it, it's yours, because what Aston had quoted to repair the car was greater than the value of the entire vehicle. So, naturally, Nigel and his friend took the car away, bought the appropriate manuals, made some friends, and fixed it. During that process, he learned that Aston Martins are simply just not as scary to work on as you might think. They are, after all, made out of many of the same parts as just about everything else. Finally, in 1994, the chance arrived for Nigel to become an Aston Martin owner when he bought a project of a 1970 DBS V8. Once the car was completed, Nigel enjoyed it not just on the road, but track too. Like the CSL, he enjoyed the thrill of competition. It was used in the Aston Martin Owners Club sprint competition, and after a few years, he realised it wasn't actually very competitive. So, in 2010, it was replaced with this, the DB4. The DBS really was always a GT car at heart, a big near 2-ton cruiser. However, the DB4 of its day was more of an outright sports car, so better suited to track driving. It weighs some half a ton less and still makes very similar power in current guise to the much bigger V8. It also was bought in a condition requiring a little bit of TLC, something that by this time Nigel was not averse to. Between himself and the previous owners, it's also seen many upgrades, making it more suitable to the requirements of road racing. What we have here, officially speaking, is a 1961 Aston Martin DB4, a Series 3 car, but according to the build sheet, made to Series 4 specifications. Not that that likely makes much difference to how the car drives. What will, though, is the fact that the 240 horsepower, 3.7-litre Tedek-Marek designed straight 6 now makes 320 horsepower, courtesy of a rebuild by Aston Engineering. The brakes have also been upgraded with DB5 items, the cooling, fuel and oil systems also upgraded to meet not just the demands of track driving, but also town. These cars in period had a reputation for overheating, and as this now does a lot of urban miles, that's not really something you want to experience. Fueling comes courtesy of triple Webers in place of the original twin SUs. They breathe through a custom airbox. The car has also been lowered and stiffened. It sits on these gorgeous 15-inch Torino heavy-duty wire wheels with Avon CRZZ competition spec radials. The colour is a gorgeous shade known as Californian Sage, one which even modern Aston Martins wear rather well. It's not actually its original hue, because it came from factory in Caribbean Pearl, though years ago, when work was done to the car, not a scrap of the original paintwork was found. That was a blue shade, also very pretty, but personally, I wouldn't change this for anything. And last but not least, it still has the original Aston Martin 4-speed manual, but with a later overdrive fitted. Long before Nigel became its custodian, this car was already competing. It even made the front page of the Aston Martin magazine way back in 1990, wearing the battle scars of that year's Coppa d'Italia. 22 years later, having been recommissioned by Nigel, it was then piloted by him to victory in the 2012 Aston Martin Works Sprint Trophy. So it's clearly a very good car on track. What's it like on the road? Probably won't surprise you to hear that this is a very, very special experience, though not at all the one that I expected. When a car is described to you as modified, ex-competition, you build all these pictures in your head, particularly something of this era. Most recently I drove the old Bristol 404, and that was a vehicle that never actually even competed. But it was a very, very physical thing to drive. Not that this isn't, more on that in a bit, but it's nowhere near the unpleasant thing that I expected. I figured this was going to be maybe a little like the Lamborghini Countach. A heck of a lot of fun, but also impossibly loud, ridiculously physical, and, to be honest, somewhat exhausting. As it turns out, nothing could be further from the truth. In the context of 1950s cars, which this really is, it's wonderfully easy to drive, and actually an impressive performer. It is a credit to its owner, Nigel, who is a wonderful human being, for bringing me a car like this out, not just full stop, but also at the edge of autumn. I was pretty much certain this review was going to get cancelled on account of the weather, but we've really lucked out. I also need to give a special mention to Davron, the people who maintain this and many other cars like it, because honestly, it's just so well mannered. Where do we even start? Well, let's begin with the engine. It's sensational, really tractable from very low down, and that, I'm told, is a contribution of the electronic ignition that this now has. At no point has it coughed or spluttered in an unpleasing manner, and it is actually quite pokey. 320 horsepower is claimed, and I believe it. The gearbox, a little bit trickier. Going from fourth to third is easy. Third to second, not so much. I got it done perfect twice earlier, and since, not repeated that feat. You have to work the gearbox at a very specific speed. In case you think I'm being some mechanical brute, I did go out with Nigel earlier and he had much the same issue. The last car I drove of this ilk was potentially that Bristol 404, but maybe more directly the Ferrari 330 2+2. That had a V12 up front, making actually only a little bit more power, was also quite tractable. The gearbox in that, much better behaved. Though to drive, I think this is better. It certainly feels like the smaller car, very easy to place. I can imagine why this is the preferred thing for track and hill climb driving, because that old V8, I've driven one of those off camera, and they're a big old bus. It is here around town that these things would typically be the scariest. The steering, of course, would be very heavy, no power assistance. The brakes, likewise, not particularly cooperative. And then you're going to look at the temperature gauge as that begins to climb and climb and climb and climb. Happily, all the modifications to stop this from boiling over have worked. It's very, very well behaved, even in London traffic, I'm told. It's also not anywhere near as hot in here as I would have expected. That engine up front is absolutely massive. You forget how big they are. The indicator is one very basic, rather weird plastic, or actually more likely Bakelite item over here on the right. You've got a number of different levers and switches and things for all your different functionality. An aftermarket hazard switch has been installed, which is quite necessary. And I love the fact that this still bears many of the stickers from its competition days. I actually have broken with tradition here, because I did do a little bit of driving before the cameras rolled. Oh, fiddle, nearly. And it's good, this car. Really good. In fact, conveniently, here is the same bit of road I was enjoying earlier. Time to enjoy it again. Official red line. I'm using about 5,000 as a guide, though I'm told in race conditions occasionally he will change up closer to 6. I'm not going to risk that today. You might be watching this video now and going, that car looks pretty, but something's not quite right about it. What's it missing? Well, the chrome bumpers are currently in the loft, because to be honest, they're not really desirable for racing, and actually I have to say, it looks quite good without them. Now, here you'll see the tractability of this engine. So I'm not going into second, which my instincts want me to, but also I don't like because apparently I've forgotten how to do it. 2,000 RPM now. I'm doing just, well, anywhere between 30 and 50 mile an hour, apparently. The Speedo is doing that, officer. So, 2,000 RPM. In fact, let's make it even harder for the old girl, shall we? Let's drop it down to about 1,500 RPM. And this, you know, a modern engine might not pull from here. Oh, we're off. There we go, 40-ish, 50-ish, and the noise. Bring the noise. And let's be honest here, if you're buying a car like this, for most people, I think that's what you want, isn't it? You want it to look like this and sound like that. And it does. It's beautiful. I'm sure a lot of you are sat there going, how much money is that worth? Well, handily, this one being competed, modified, isn't worth maybe quite as much as an original Concours example. I personally happen to think that this is actually the way that these cars should be, because this is how they would have been treated in period. You would not have had a second thought about modifying these, changing the colours, putting different wheels on, retrimming the interior, though I do draw the line at a Webasto. To stick a big sunroof in here would be, well, just tragic. If this were a DB5, it'd probably be worth about £1 million. And to be honest, I'm never really sure whether with a DB5 and the like, race competition actually makes it worth more or less. Considering it hasn't won any famous races, probably a bit less. A DB4, you're talking about £400,000, maybe a bit more. So it's not exactly cheap, and I probably should be a little bit more concerned about piloting it in this fashion than I am. But the fact is, the car is talking to me wonderfully, and I'm really getting on with it. Nigel did paint a picture of it as being perhaps a little bit more ungainly than it really is. Sure, the steering is quite heavy, really does weight up in the bends. It also fidgets about a lot, as you might be able to see. It's not me just doing that. I actually should probably say sorry to a few actors I've criticised, including the odd Bond, because I thought when they were sat there in front of the rear projection screens doing that, they were just being morons. But no, that's what their Aston actually drove like. Even the turning circle's not actually that bad. This car's really quite impressive performance is coming not just of that very nice 3.7 litre straight six, but also this car's Superleggera construction, which is why it's so comparatively light. The Superleggera name I'm sure you've seen a few times, perhaps on the Lamborghini Gallardo Superleggera, or indeed the latest Aston Martin DB4 Superleggera. In Italian, the words just mean super light. For this car, I suppose there's some truth to it. The new DB4, not so much. However, here, Superleggera is actually a construction method, originally pioneered by another firm, whose name I forget, but then adopted by Carrozzeria Touring, who you may have heard of. This is a way of building a car with an interesting shape, keeping the weight low, and also making it reasonably easy to construct. The method was used on the DB4, the DB5, and also things like the Lamborghini 350 GT. You still have, at the heart of this car, a regular chassis as you'd find in much else of the time. The Superleggera bit refers to the construction method for the bodywork, because what you have here is essentially a super thin aluminium skin draped over a network of interconnecting thin steel tubes. Imagine essentially an exoskeleton that provides you a template for the shape of the car. This is a way to be able to come up with some pretty wild looking shapes. I mean, just look at it. The curves and style of this thing are absolutely sensational. Even the panel fit and finish is actually reasonably good for a car of the era. The spicier DB4 GT actually took things a little bit further by having even thinner aluminium skin. There was also, in between the DB4 and the GT, a Vantage and the super rare and now very valuable Zagato. The major downside of the construction method was that if you didn't know what you're doing, which many companies didn't, they were going to be quite prone to galvanic corrosion. Where steel and aluminium meet, they don't often get on all that well. Companies like Bristol, who also used the construction method, had experience from aerospace, so they knew how to get the two to play ball. Values are a funny thing, because I was talking with Nigel about it. He purchased this car when it was worth a fraction of what it is now, and even he says he really would probably rather that it wasn't worth as much as it is. Sure, he'd make a couple of quid selling it, but the fact is, if he didn't sell it, well, the value is irrelevant, and he'd rather not sell it. But when something becomes worth a certain amount of money, unless you yourself are also worth even more, it does become hard to ignore either the possibility of something going wrong, and your asset being destroyed, stolen, written off, or lost, or the fact that you'll maybe stop enjoying it because you'll be worried about it being destroyed, stolen, written off, or lost. So I really must commend him for driving and using it in quite the way that he does. Now, reverse is all the way over and down. Visibility is superb. We've got nearly uninterrupted glass all the way to the back. Clutch really nice and light and easy. Throttle also quite light. Brake fairly heavy, but I've got no problem with that. See, first to second, absolutely fine. And the thing I love about it is that I can have an absolutely great time just pootling about like I am now. Or I could give it some pings. Despite the fact that the suspension is somewhat uprated, it's still a very, very comfortable car. Doesn't even follow the camber all that badly. And I have to say, the turn-in is really impressive. This thing is very keen off centre. If anything, I'm told that one of the criticisms about setting a car like this up in this way is that it won't really handle like it would in period, particularly if it had been shod with cross splies. Your natural thing to do with this is just, well, drift it about. I'm sure you've all seen the footage from 1950s and 60s racers, even Formula 1 cars. In those days, drifting was the quickest way to get around a bend. This has a little bit too much grip. You can slide it about on track, but on the road, you'd just be carrying a little bit too much speed. To non-Aston people, I think the DB4, 5 and 6 all do kind of blend into one. The 6 is actually the one that's quite different. It's considerably larger than a 4 or 5. Those two are much closer. And let's not beat about the bush, shall we? If James Bond had driven a DB4, it's these that would be worth the big money, not the 5. Handily, there is a great team of dedicated people out there, like the people at Davron, to keep these running, and so, though they're not a particularly cheap thing to maintain, it is possible to do it. Amongst owners who also drive their cars on a regular basis, particularly in a sporty fashion, I think you'll also find a fair amount of acceptance for modifications that are sympathetic to the nature of the car. If it helps you enjoy it just that little bit more or more often, what's wrong with it? Nigel no longer competes this car, though the reason he stopped using it wasn't just because of its increasing value, but also the fact he'd won the championship with it, so in some ways achieved his goals, and he decided to try something a little bit different. Taking its place on the track was an Austin Healey 100M, which he no longer possesses, but he also has, alongside this, a DB4, a car that I know next to nothing about, but have been offered to have a go in next year. So if you'd like to see that, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share, because that'll encourage Nigel to bring me that. Well, provided I bring this car back in roughly the same shape it was given to me, Nigel has said I can have a go of that next year when it comes back. But share and like and all that stuff anyway, please. Thank you. This also is a car that, if you were so inclined, I think you really could actually use every day. Sure, it's a little more physical than what you might be used to, but by the standards of the day, it's really not actually that bad. I think it's an easier drive than the DB6, but that could just be my memory playing tricks with me, or my expectations being so different to what the car actually was. It has bag seats, though they're of limited use. You will get small people in there, probably wouldn't take children out in it. The boot is also a reasonable enough size, so if you want to take the car away as a couple for a weekend, you can easily do that. I must confess, ahead of today, I was really quite nervous about this. This is a big deal for me. I know I get to drive a lot of really nice stuff all the time, but this is one of those cars that is pretty much my worst case scenario. It is both very valuable and also of some sentimental value to its owner. It is really quite irreplaceable. Yet, doing stuff like that, a little overtake with someone going far, far too slow on an arrow straight piece of road, I've no worries about. None whatsoever. I know I'm probably taking things a little bit too easy in this, but it's also just brilliant. It's alive, this thing. Fabulous, wonderful. And you know something? I've always said that really these early Astons don't do anything for me. I enjoyed driving the DB6. It was a lovely experience, one I'm incredibly lucky to have had. But it wasn't a car that excited. I wasn't looking for DB6s in the classifieds afterwards. This though, oh, this is great. If great Uncle Bertie fell off his yacht in the Seychelles and left me this, I wouldn't be selling it. It's brilliant. And even better when it becomes either so valuable you daren't take it anywhere, or illegal and you're not allowed to take it anywhere. It's still so pretty that you can put it in a glass case and just stare at it while you have a nice civilized cup of tea. I had hoped that today was going to be somewhat enjoyable, and it certainly has been. But what I really wasn't expecting was to fall for this car. And I really, really have. The DB4, this DB4, has rather effectively wormed its way into my heart. I love it, and I can see why Nigel does too. So then, a huge thank you to him for bringing this out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and even if you have, make sure you've checked the bell icon so you'll be notified of every upcoming video. And whatever it is, I hope to see you there. Bye-bye.